Today on the season finale of the Wrestling Roundtable for 2009, what should WCW have done after Starrcade 97 and Submission Round 3? Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. It's the season finale here for 2009, and before we get into introducing some of our newest panelists, we wanted to thank you, the fans, for 2009. Thousands of you watching on YouTube, over 900 fans on MySpace, and a total cumulative video views of 750,000 views. Pretty good for a show that just started off a couple years ago, and we're going to take it even further. But I wanted to let you know, of course, that even though we're taking our seasonal break, the show isn't quite ever really going away. We're always going to have a lot for you on WrestlingRoundtable.com and our other sites, MySpace, Facebook, and Twitter. But because of WrestlingRoundtable.com, you may have also been introduced to our newest panelist, Jason Aletto, who supplied guest columns and debuted, so to speak, on camera on our video blog. He's been a fan of 22 years, and we wanted to bring you on the show specifically because you are a fan of the Wrestling Roundtable.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining the show. Thank you for viewing.
Thank you, guys.
And this theme of this show is going to be a big thank you to our fans. This is a fan-driven show. All the content has been chosen by you, obviously the Q&A, but this topic, what should WCW have done after Starrcade 97, was in our first t-shirt contest, won by Stephen Maleksy of Asheville, North Carolina. Also joining us on our panel for the first time is Will Vafides. He's been a fan of 19 years and worked in wrestling as a wrestler and editor. And of course, to my left, which is your right, is regular Rodney LeConte, director of the documentary The Grappling Kings and a fan of 20 years. I'm your host, Eric Santamaria, fan of 20 years, worked in wrestling 5 years, and been a director, videographer, and producer in all that time. But we're going to get down to business with this dream scenario. And it may not be totally fair, because obviously hindsight is 2020. We've seen what really did happen with WCW, but the premise we're going to go with for what should WCW have done after Starrcade is Starrcade 97, the fucking disaster that it was, has happened. We can't do anything to change it. You're in charge of WCW from here on. Take it to Starrcade 98. What do you do with WCW?
I would have started a slow burn feud with Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan. That's what everybody wanted to see for years, and that's what would have been the first thing on the plate. Also, I would have made the world title something unique with Sting.
He could go off and do his own thing.
He could do his own thing. He'd be away. You'd have him defended against NWO guys such as Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Kurt Hennig. Push those guys up a little bit to the main event.
So you'd keep the NWO around?
I keep the NWO around, sure, but I wouldn't keep it around for the entire year. I would have the NWO be broken up by Starrcade, leading into some big matches at Starrcade 98 with Kevin Nash versus Scott Hall, maybe, and also build Bill Goldberg. My first pay-per-view after Starrcade 98 sold out, I would have Hulk Hogan versus Sting 2. And have Sting go over cleanly, just as he should have in the first one. Throughout the year, I'd have Sting feud, like I said, with Savage and guys like that.
This Bret Hart Hulk Hogan scenario is interesting though because it really was the big match that they never did in 93. Some of you may remember they started planting the seeds, much like the Triple H Austin stuff in 99. They started planting the seeds for that in WWF Magazine. The Fox versus the Hound, Old School versus New Generation.
That should never happen in 93.
It was supposed to happen at SummerSlam according to Bret Hart. So if you build that up for a year like you did with Sting Hogan and put it on Starrcade 1998, you have a bigger buy rate than Starrcade 1997 in my opinion. Goldberg get the U.S. title, defend it through the year, push guys like Raven up. So basically I would build that feud and push new stars up because that's what they did too. And they should have done it the whole time. You push new stars and you make...
The only thing they did push new stars, but when it was too late, when they had nothing else to do, like 2000, 2001. So by that time, the fans weren't buying it.
They also only got to a certain level because the mid-card in WCW 98 was really on fire.
Oh, yeah.
Jericho, Malenko, Guerrero coming up, Booker T, a lot of guys that were coming up, Jericho as a heel, but that was the time they should have been taken to the next level because this same old 10 people on top was really getting old. But what are you going to say for...
How I look at it is this. Bret Hart just came off of the biggest screw job in wrestling history. Right away, why not use that to build that character? Because the Hitman character, according to Bret Hart, was totally dead after he was out of WWE. Build Bret Hart up to be the next guy for WCW. and it didn't happen. They made him the guy who was below Hulk Hogan, and out of his control,
It was his lackey.
He was
It
his
was
lackey.
pathetic.
Yeah.
Wearing Hulk Hogan shirts, walking around like that.
God.
Amazing, and the fact that he screwed him, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere he just became friends with him, which was like
It was
the
so
weirdest thing. It was
forced, too.
it was forced. It was not real. No one bought into it. When they see someone like Goldberg come in, destroying everybody like the way he did, that was believable because he did beat everybody in 3 minutes and less.
Especially when he first started squashing people like Jerry Flynn. That looked like a Japanese UWFI sort of match. They're doing stuff way ahead of their time with some work shoot looking sort of stuff because we know Goldberg says that he based a lot of his character on UFC coming up at the time. It was just the beginning days of UFC, so to speak. But he was really into that style, and you watch that match specifically back now, it looks like, whoa, this was way ahead of its time.
And the main thing I would have done is I would have definitely saved Goldberg and Hogan for Starrcade. That would have been for the next year. That would have been it. Not
On TV.
Not on TV. I understand why they did it. It was in the Georgia Dome, 40,000 people. It made a lot of sense. Even Goldberg even says, I didn't even know about the match till like a few days before.
On Thunder when they announced
when they announced it. So it doesn't make any sense. Why not put Goldberg and Hogan, who was the biggest built star probably in WCW history, put him in against Hogan and end the NWO at that Starrcade and would have been done. I would have ended it.
Because they used pay-per-views, at least Bischoff said he did, as an unofficial chapter end or beginning. So it would have been more official if Goldberg had beaten him on pay-per-view. I mean, everyone says, who criticizes it, that they lost out on a big buy rate and therefore a ton of money. But they did do a huge rating that night, too.
Absolutely. They definitely brought themselves back up just for a little bit, but they didn't capitalize on it. And then when you start seeing the booking changes when the Poke of Doom that happened, that was what really just stopped.
I thought I had the Poke of Doom last night. But anyway, what would you do with WCW, Rodney?
First thing I would do is acknowledge the screw job that was Starrcade 97. Have J.J. Dillon come out and say, we understand that Sting was pinned. It wasn't a fast count. And
That was the worst thing I've ever seen.
yeah. Just acknowledge it, but say, you know what? But we're not going to give Hogan a rematch. Set up Sting, maybe some of his giant that's sold out. Keep NWO off TV. None of them are NWO on TV. Sting and Giant have their match. NWO comes out from the crowd, completely destroys everybody. Then Hogan's going to say, I'm going to go through everybody until I get back to Sting. Sting still refused to give him his title shot.
Well,
Fine.
Hogan had been the champion on and off for about a year and a half.
Right.
And it was a fucking terrible thing if you're a world title fan because he barely ever defended it.
Yeah.
And when he did, it was in these garbage matches with screwjob finishes.
Screwjobs.
But that was good for the character if the blow-off was good with Sting because they have this death grip on what's supposed to be the power and the most important thing representing your company as the champion. They've got it. It's in their clutches. We have to get it back. That's why it was great when Luger won it for a day or a few days, but that one night, that little tease for what the blow-off is going to be. It was more or less a tease of, look, we know this has been going on with the NWO finishes for so long, but just give it a little more time because you know Sting's going to win at Starrcade. They ended up screwing it up.
Then what I would do is when finally Hogan and Sting have their rematch, have Bret Hart help Sting win after the NWO comes and tried to help Hogan win, set up the finally Bret Hart versus Hogan. Hogan says, you're one of the reasons why I lost the belts. Bret Hart gets his big win over Sting, works his way to the title, and then maybe I'd have Bret and Goldberg at Starrcade in a big match.
A year early, huh?
Yeah, I would do that when it mattered, when it really counted. What I'd also do is build Raven up to feud with Sting. Maybe have Raven come out in Sting's match saying, this guy lost. Why is everybody cheering him? What about me? What about Raven? And really build this dark, strong character.
A lot of people at the time were saying they wanted to see Raven Sting. It's much like this dream match that never happened with Sting Undertaker where people are like, oh, they're two dark characters. We want to see them fight. That Raven was the answer for that in 98. And he did have some creative control, if I'm not mistaken, in his contract.
Raven should have been built up bigger than what he was, and that's probably one of the reasons why he did leave WCW. But I really would have built on the Raven character a lot more than they did. Keep the flag. Definitely keep what they do with Goldberg. That was right.
The only problem with that is Paul Heyman was really a real catalyst to that character. You don't have anybody there who has never seen Raven. They don't really probably even knew anything really about him.
You didn't have the vignettes or anything like that.
They could have.
That were as good as the ECW ones, the original ones. They weren't as good. They weren't as dark.
But he still came to his own in WCW. He still really came to his own. The feud he had his Page was really good. They had some good matches. But I think Raven knew enough about the character where he could really go forth with it.
Well, we're going to go forth into our next segment because coming up, more of what should WCW have done after Starrcade 97.
They tell you guys that in World Civ we talk about New World Order and I can't get NW out of my head.
You talk about the New World Order in your Civ class? Ladies and gentlemen, the New World Order. Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. We're changing up the panel. Sitting to my left, which is your right, Lawrence Haber, fan of over 20 years, musician. And to my right, which is your left, Chris Harris, fan of 16 years and a vault manager. And to my right also, which is your left also, pro wrestler of 5 years and a fan of 23 years and manager of the ROH World Tag Team Champions, the American Wolves, Shane Hagadorn. So, picking up where we left off, day after WCW Starrcade 97, what do you do for another year?
J.J. Dillon comes out, makes the Hogan-Sting rematch, says we have to have finality. If Sting wins, no more NWO. Sting destroys Hogan. The NWO is dissolved. Hall and Nash are unhappy. They turn on Hogan, form a new Wolfpack faction with some up-and-coming wrestlers, Guerrero and Conan.
Would this be an NWO?
No, it would be there just to placate.
Not a red one.
No, it would be there just to placate the fans. A hot new faction with 4 wrestlers that they really like to see.
Mm-hmm.
Sting still has a chip on his shoulder, and Raven is in his ear trying to turn him. So Sting begins a feud with Luger and some other WCW guys just to continue his reign without interfering with any of the NWO
Is
stuff.
this a friendly sort of feuding
friendly
thing?
kind of feud, but there's indication that Sting might be going heel because
Okay.
Raven's trying to influence him. Bret brings in the Hart Foundation, which of course is the Dungeon, as everybody has called it many times.
Everybody
And
being me?
everybody being you, and I've heard it in some other circles as well, and brings in some young guys like Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
Also, he who we do not speak of, who turns on the Horsemen. Horsemen dissolve completely. Flair has to run through the Dungeon Hart Foundation, leading to a match with Bret. Part of that will be Dean Malenko trying to convince Flair to get the Horsemen back together.
Mm-hmm.
Goldberg continues his streak, spends the year getting built up because he still needs to do that, while Raven tries to turn Sting and eventually has him feud with DDP. Now, all of this leads to a War Games match between the Dungeon's biggest members, which are Bret and he who we do not speak of, Guerrero, Hall, and Nash, to put in the 2 heel factions together. And they face Flair, Malenko, Luger, Horseman, and the Giant, also now a Horseman, and Goldberg, 5-on-5 War Games match, which brings us to Starrcade. DDP versus Bret for the WCW title. DDP has beaten Sting. Raven has turned on Sting. Sting fights Raven in a cage in a grudge match. Goldberg fights the Giant with Flair in his corner. Jericho versus Malenko versus He Who for the U.S. title. Hall and Nash versus Conan and Guerrero. They turn on WCW Tag Team titles. And Steiner versus Hogan at Starrcade.
Scott Steiner so soon, huh?
Steiner turns and fights Hogan. And Steiner's beginning his own streak at this point to build up to Goldberg and Steiner at Starrcade 99.
I start off immediately with Hogan and Bret. Hogan comes out, you got screwed by Vince McMahon, and now you screwed me. But not to make him a heel, we have Bret bring up all of 93.
Mm-hmm.
You held me down.
Hogan holding everyone else down.
This is me helping out the other guys here,
Mm-hmm.
who you've been screwing since you got here.
Just like he did to
Just
me.
like that. Then what we do is I turn Luger heel. Because
That's never happened.
Luger is actually the guy that ended Hogan's world title reign, and he doesn't think he got any credit.
Okay.
So he's going after Sting. Everybody loves Sting because he ended this. I did it, and you people didn't care. You're building up Goldberg all year long. He's going to go through everybody from Raven, Jericho, Hall, Nash. He's going to go through the entire undercard to middle card.
So does everybody think, because this seems to be the consensus, that Goldberg got the title too soon? Should they have built it up more?
Yeah. Definitely.
I don't agree.
So Sting's going to stay the champ the whole year, though, on my plan. He's going to go through all the top guys. Leading up to World War III, we're finally going to get our Hogan-Sting rematch. Sting will win clean in this match, and Goldberg's going to win the World War III match to face Sting the next month at Starrcade.
I did Hogan and Bret right out of the gate for the same reasons. It made the most sense. Whereas I have Sting going through Hall and Nash, because Hall still has that title shot
From World War
III
III.
the previous year. And with all the crap that they did back and forth, he ended up not getting a shot for like 3 months later. So instead I do it right at Sold Out, then it's Nash steps up. And then I finally do the rematch at Uncensored in a cage. And at which point from there, I would take the NWO off TV for a month. Since Great American Bash is one of their signature shows, it was a tour pay-per-view as an NWO free pay-per-view until...
Are they not allowed in the building sort of thing?
Just they're off TV.
Oh, okay.
They've been off TV aside from some more of those public service announcements. The main event, Sting and Luger, an old classic WCW NWA style match.
You could even fill the undercard with NWA sort of stuff with Steiner's and Dusty's around this whole time too.
Yeah, yep, exactly. But then, of course, this is the moment the NWO ruins, thereby setting up the War Games at Bash at the Beach, where I think it's the most appropriate to dissolve.
Where they end will be where they began.
Exactly. I like doing the whole
Full circle
parallels
thing,
and full circles
And other
with everything.
geographical sort of,
Yes.
geometric.
Yes. And at which point I have that with Goldberg building up Goldberg. And Goldberg's the guy who finally gets that last pinfall, running through Hall, Nash, and Hogan. Put an effective end of the NWO.
He's got to be the guy for WCW to do it.
Exactly. Sting offhandedly promising a title shot to Goldberg as a thank you, which he slowly starts to backpedal on from that point on, building up to Starrcade. Where at first it's not working out, the booking committee or whatever, the people making the matches aren't making the match happen. And then he just slowly starts backpedaling on to say, well, it was never official. You never earned that actual title match. There's no stipulation, forcing him to have to win World War III.
Like the WCW version of you have to win the Royal Rumble from number one.
Exactly. The dungeon idea. I really liked that, and using that last 10 minutes, sort of like they did with Shawn Michaels and Undertaker, using that last 10 minutes for Goldberg and who we did not speak of, as sort of a prelude to what my whole 1999 in my head would be like. So ultimately it comes down to Sting and Goldberg at Starrcade for the world title. Goldberg obviously finally wins the belt and goes on through 99. Building up his wins, going over some of the top talent. Well, the undercard is getting built up with The Dungeon, with Raven, who I actually ended up putting with Hogan as well. Because Hogan's big thing is looking for redemption after everything. Seems like there's a lot of parallels with everybody's.
There is, and that's what I find really interesting. We did not discuss each other's ideas. We had no idea what everyone is going to say before we taped today. And it seems like there's a lot of common themes. And I find that really interesting. There's some diversions here and there, Bret Hogan starting off instead of later on. But to not go into detail about what everyone else already said, mine was going to be building up to Goldberg and Sting at Starrcade, and here's why. We know, as in the first segment I discussed, Hogan's reign was so terrible for WCW. You have to give the fans relief after sitting through this war with the NWO. Give them a face to cheer. That was Sting, the most over guy in the company.
But Sting wasn't wrestling for a year and a half also, so there are now plenty of guys for him to face in 12 months.
He's got to go back on the road for this to happen. And the other thing is, of course, we know Goldberg is being built up. And I did have the idea of the dungeon horseman sort of thing, and he who we do not speak of caught in the middle. Now, we focused mainly on the main event sort of guys. There's a lot of people on the undercard to work with, and one name that wasn't mentioned at all by anybody was Wrath, who was super over in 1997 going into 98. And he was doing really well with the fans up until Nash decided to beat him too.
Yeah.
But in addition to him, we've got the guys we mentioned like Jericho, Raven, Eddie Guerrero. There's a whole plethora, Booker T, of great WCW mid-card guys that you need to start juxtaposing. And that was going to be, at my Bash at the Beach as well, was going to be the big War Games to end it all. Everything's on the line. 10 on 10, WCW versus NWO. And this is a spot where guys like Goldberg and Wrath and whoever can step up and be mixed in with the guys that we already know, like Luger and Sting and the Giant and blah, blah, blah. And Hogan's redemption is really interesting because Hogan, if the NWO ends and they turn on him because they're the heels, they got to get rid of that guy. Hogan's really interesting because he was never really accepted truly in WCW from 94 to 96 as a babyface. So when they turned him heel, this was the chance to boo him like they really wanted to do and were starting to do anyway. So now that he was the anti-WCW character as a heel, he's a man without a country now. So if you put him in the position that he needs to win back the fans, he needs to get started back up, I think the catalyst for that should be the Warrior when he shows up in the summer of 98. In August when he showed up, this would have been a great springboard because really, Hogan Warrior did win the ratings for that segment. Everyone wanted to see the Warrior, so they tuned in. Fine enough. I don't know if we wanted to see their match. No. We know how bad it turned out to be. But if you're going to have the Warrior come in, set him on the right path. Hogan needs to destroy what he created with the Outsiders and the NWO sort of guys. But Raven is also in a similar position because he was the leader of a faction too that split up in 98. Saturn, who's another guy who should have been built up, started the flock breaking up. So Raven can start going through all of these former flock members who left him, kind of like Eddie Guerrero did in the LWO in 99, and then he gets his hands on Hogan's nephew, Horace. And then our storylines come together, and this will lead to Hogan's redemption. Well, maybe we can continue this on WrestlingRoundtable.com because, as you can see, I put a lot of time and thought into this. This is every match for every pay-per-view in 98, so maybe I'll put it online for everyone to read and see what you think. But coming up next, you're going to ask us some of the questions you want answered because Submission Round 3 is coming up next.